Here then we have the dielectric material, a pretty simple and straightforward material which is often going to be the go-to option for doing glass. Now you might recall back in the foundations we talked about conductors and insulators, or conductors and dielectrics, and of course we mentioned that insulator materials, dielectrics, more or less the same thing. Broadly speaking, metals are conductors and others are dielectrics, including of course plastics and the like. However, the dielectric material here really is a transparency material. It's not something you would usually use for doing a solid opaque plastic. You would use it for glass. Perhaps some clear plastics, perspex and the like. Personally, I find those are better served with the principled material, and as such the dielectric is usually best saved for glass type materials or crystal type materials, so gemstones and the like as well. Pretty straightforward options. Of course, you've got colour, which is the actual colour of the main material itself. So using red here, as you can see, gives us this red type of glass. I suppose what that immediately brings to mind is the fact that you can use this for certain fluids as well. So, something like wine in a glass you might do using this kind of thing. As you can see, where it's thin it goes very red, where it's thick it goes black. But that's not the only way of tinting the colour, because you have this transmittance colour as well, and this is the colour of light that gets transmitted through it. Basically you can think of it as the opposite of absorption. So for instance we can set the actual colour of the glass, so to speak, to be white here. We can come over to transmittance and we can set that to be red. And you can see that what we get as a result is something that's broadly similar to what we had the other way round. You'll notice, of course, that because of this balancing, if we set things to opposite sides of the spectrum, so here the colour is this cyan, this, light blue colour, whilst the transmittance is red, then what we get is just black all over, because we're telling it that the colour of the glass is cyan, so basically that's saying that it transmits cyan light and absorbs all other light. The light that will be absorbed the most is that on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is red, but here we're telling it to transmit red light. So it essentially just winds up transmitting nothing. The other thing that you'll see we have is transmittance distance, which is how far through the object light rays will penetrate before they are just fully absorbed, before they run out of energy and don't come out the other side. This is given as a distance, so of course it is dependent upon the size and the actual thickness of your object. In this case, this little statue model is about 300-ish millimeters tall. So the distance through the head there is about 100 millimeters. Some of these thin bits on the front of the chest there, they're coming down to as low as like 10 and 15 millimeters. So what we see at present, of course, is that the head is very dark because it's quite thick and our transmittance distance is set low at only 10 mil. If we take that up to 100 millimeters, then as you can plainly see, we're getting much more light penetration through the actual head part, and of course these thin parts are becoming ever clearer and clearer. If we go all the way up to 1 meter, then of course we're getting much more penetration. Of course these thin areas are becoming almost entirely clear. Of course the amount of tinting of the refracted light, of the passing through light, is dependent upon the thickness, and it's when we get into this thickness that we start to see the difference between the glass colour and the transmittance colour and how they work together. So you'll see that if I flip them there, so the actual colour of the glass is blue, we're no longer getting that clearer section appearing here. It is this colour throughout. What you will find in the real world is that the vast majority of coloured glass has its colour by virtue of the light that it is absorbing and the other light that it is transmitting through. And as a result, coloured glass in the real world generally, as it gets thinner, it does become clearer, and as it builds thicker, then it does become darker. As such, very often keeping your main colour to white and your transmittance colour to whatever tint you're wanting to put into the glass is the better way to go for more realistic looks a lot of the time. Now you might have noticed that despite the quite deep penetration, despite the deep transmission distance that I've got set here, of course large areas of this model are still just coming out black. That is, in this case, down to our ray recursions. Obviously most of the light coming through this is refracted light, so do keep an eye with your transparent surfaces, not just dielectric, but actually all surfaces on your recursions. You'll see that if I put my ray recursion up to 8, and of course I need to make sure that I've got at least as many refraction recursions there, then oh look, our glass starts to become much more transparent. Of course that leads to, ever longer renders, but it does become more and more realistic the more of these recursions that we actually have for our refraction rays. Next, obviously we have roughness, which gives reflective and refractive roughness, so of course as that increases, then of course we start to get this roughened or frosted glass appearance. Notice of course this does for both the refraction and any specularity. So what you really can't do with dielectric is do the sort of frosted inside, polished outside look to glass. Again, it's for that you would probably turn to the principled material, having the clear coat. Refraction index, of course, how much does it bend the light? So if you set it to 1, then of course it's just, nothing. It's ethereal and ghostly like this. 1.4 to 1.6 is pretty good and standard for most types of glass. And then finally we have this refraction dispersion, which if we give it, let's say 30%, we start to see we get this red, green and blue ray separation. And so we start to get separation of the red, green and blue refractions, giving us this chromatic aberration refraction effect. In the real world, this is an effect that happens during almost all types of refraction through solid objects. In most glass items, it's exceedingly minimal and hard to see, so usually it can just be kept turned off and ignored entirely. It is something that is much more common in gemstones and other crystals. At least it becomes more visible in those types of objects. Anything that has a prismatic shape, a geometric shape, as opposed to a sculptural shape, will show it. As you can possibly see, it is quite a noisy effect, and to clean it up really does require more refraction samples. This can of course be something of a hog in terms of render time. However, you will notice that it can give some really lovely subtle effects. If we look round here on the cheek, we can see there's some of that, spectral refraction creeping in there, and along the shoulder of it here where the surface is a little bit wobbly, we're getting some really beautiful details coming in as well. Notice this effect is going to be most visible on clear glass rather than coloured glass, of course, but it is an expensive one to render, so if you're doing some still product shots, it might be worth taking the extra time for it. Otherwise it can often be missed because it is a very subtle effect. So there we have it. That is the dielectric material, pretty much a one-stop shop for all kinds of glassy type surfaces. Quick, simple and easy to use without a great deal of tweaking required in order to get something that looks lovely and realistic.